I'm Jim Zogby and welcome to Viewpoint. Tonight we'll cover a range of Mideast issues, including the latest on Syria with Ellen Lapson from the Henry L. Stimson Center. Then we'll get an analysis of this week's GOP presidential debate with Alex Rorty of the National Journal. But first, a discussion on Iran. I want to welcome Trita Parsi, co-founder and president of the National Iranian American Council, former foreign policy advisor on Middle East issues to Congressman Bob Ney. And an author. Your book on the triangular relationship between Iran, Israel, and the Arab world is fascinating, and a new one coming out in early next year.
Actually, the Kindle version will be out mid-December.
But the book on the Obama administration.
Exactly. It's called The Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran.
Well, I'm going to have you back on when that's out.
Love to.
I want to talk about the International Atomic Energy, the report that was out. You suggest in an article you did that the hype about the report was far more exciting, I think was the word you used, than the report itself. But there were findings there that indicate Iran developing or working to develop nuclear weapons. And the question of the timeline is the issue, and not the timeline it'll take to get them, but the timeline of when they actually were doing it. Give me what your sense of this report is.
What the report does is that most of what's in the report is detailing things that we essentially already knew. That prior to 2003, the Iranians were involved in activities that had clear weaponization components and purposes. And the report also details that these were very, very structured activities. So this was not something limited, it was actually something quite extensive. We also knew that in 2003, they abruptly stopped it, because that's what the American NIAC also said, and the American NIAC actually very much reflected what the IAEA had been saying for quite some time. What is new, though, in this is that there's also information given to the IAEA by two member states that the Iranians have actually continued some of those activities as late as 2008, 2009. Now, we have to also remember that these are allegations, not necessarily established facts. The agency would most likely not be putting things like this in the report unless they found it to be credible. But we also have had a situation in the past that the agency's credibility at times have come under question. Now, obviously, the Iranians immediately are doing that. But it shows to me that we are really lacking transparency. During the period in which we had greater transparency, inspections, verification, that's also the time that the Iranians were not doing this kind of stuff. And in conversations with White House officials just recently, they also made the point that the Iranian government is very, very sensitive about news about this. So when the world's eyes and ears are there and they're getting inspected, they're not engaging in these activities.
Is transparency possible?
I think it is, and I think one of the things that we on our end in the U.S. have not put sufficient emphasis on is to actually reach a solution that puts transparency, verification, and inspections at the very center. We have primarily pursued an approach that is centered on just preventing them from doing what they're doing, essentially saying that they don't have a right under the NPT, they cannot have enrichment, etc., which is a very problematic position from a legal standpoint for the U.S. to take. Instead of putting greater emphasis on that, okay, it is true, the NPT does provide countries with the right to have a peaceful nuclear program, but it comes with responsibilities, and in order for the world to feel confident that this is not a fake peaceful program, that it has other dimensions, there needs to be significant transparency. And let me just say something about the transparency part I think is important to keep in mind. It's not just a pretty word. Today, if the Iranians were to do some sort of a divergence in a military direction in the known sites, it could take up to 30 to 60 days for the IAEA to find out. If the Iranians sign, ratify, implement the additional protocol, the IAEA can not only have a 24 presence in Iran in the sense so that their inspectors don't have to apply for a visa to go there, but they can also install in the known sites instruments that would enable them to instantaneously find out. within 24 hours if something wrong is happening. And that's a very, very strong deterrence.
The media hype was rather significant here. Some editorials pretty tough. But a White House advisor was downplaying it. Let me put up the quote from a White House advisor who was quoted anonymously in many of the news accounts. He said the IAEA does not assert that Iran resumed a full-scale nuclear weapons program, nor does it have a program about how advanced the programs really are. Why would they do that? Why would they issue a statement of that sort? What's the White House intention here?
Well, I think the White House is, on the one hand, wanting to portray themselves as being tough on this issue and taking strong action, while at the same time try to control the conversation so it doesn't get out of hand, because if it does, the White House would end up being under significant pressure to take military action. And I think it's quite clear that the administration does not see that, at least not right now, as a very attractive option. So it was important for the White House, I think, to also make sure that the report is put in its rightful context. It is not saying that there is an ongoing weapons program there right now.
So the report was preceded by what had been an internal Israeli debate, we're told, which became a public debate about military action. One of these hold us back guys because we're going to. You argue that it's the gift that keeps giving. The Israelis have a tendency to do this at different times. It succeeded in one thing, took pressure off of them on settlements. Nobody's talking about that right now. How serious is this Israeli threat from your view?
I don't think we should dismiss it. We should not completely dismiss it out of hand. But I also think we have to take a close look at the history here. And you see two phenomena. You see that these sudden flurries of, oh, we got to go and bomb them and it's just going to happen any time now, tend to coincide with two different things. Either a situation like this in which there is a sanctions resolution or an attempt for a sanctions resolution, and the intention seems to be to put pressure on the United States to say, you either go and you get massive sanctions, otherwise Israel is going to feel forced to do something. The US then uses the same argument when it goes to the Europeans and to the Russians and the Chinese to make the same argument. We have to do something about this, otherwise the Israelis may take unilateral action, and that would be a disaster. And it's been effective. It's been the gift that keeps on giving, because it seems to work, even though people realize that it's somewhat of a transparent ploy, it nevertheless seems to work. The other instance in which it tends to happen around is when there actually is a progress on the diplomatic front, when there actually is an indication that the U.S. might just compromise, some agreement might just be found. Then also you have a situation in which the Israelis again increase the volume of their war talk, which seems to be intended to scuttle any type of a compromise.
If the Israelis did, what would the consequences be?
Well, it's difficult to tell because it's also depending on how broad these attacks are. If it is a massive bombing campaign that also targets non-nuclear facilities, and it's a large war, I think the Iranian government would probably have few incentives not to enlarge the conflict. And that means taking it beyond perhaps in many places in the region. You also have the option in Iran to do something to the Strait of Hormuz. And it's not that they would mine it or something. I think, what they may just be able to do is to take one of their own old tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, blow it up. And that in and of itself would create a significant problem because the strait is so narrow.
The British Daily Mail, not always the most credible source, but today reports that there is evidence that Israel will do this with U.S. logistic support. Is that likely? Is that possible that the U.S. would engage in this activity with Israel before Christmas is what they're saying?
Right now, I don't believe so. Right now, I don't believe so. The White House is well aware of the horrific impact it would have on the energy markets, which would translate into immediately higher gas prices in the United States, which immediately translates into far greater difficulty to create jobs. So I don't think the administration right now is geared towards that. But the more you have these stories, the more it seems like, well, they may have bluffed in the past, but we can't risk it. They may be really serious this time, so we have to go for more sanctions.
Russia and China, Russia in particular, very aggressive, saying no sanctions, no further extension of sanctions, no broadening of sanctions. Is this program is designed, this effort on Israel's part is designed to to sort of force the Russian hand on this? How
It's
likely
actually
is that?
To be frank, I think that it's targeting the United States and Europe more so.
For
they-
unilateral, not unilateral,
Exactly.
but not UN, not a
Exactly.
UN resolution.
To cut them off financially and everything else. The Russians and the Chinese are clearly not going to go along with this, at least not very easily. The Russians and the Chinese are not pleased at all with the way Libya turned out, in the sense that they did not believe that they voted for a resolution that endorsed military regime change. So there's a lot of tensions and bad blood over that. So I don't even think the administration right now is expecting any sanctions to be passed in the Security Council. You're going to see more unilateral action by the United States and the Europeans, and a lot of pressure by the U.S. on other countries to adopt similar sanctions.
If you want to get in the conversation, give us a call. If you're calling from overseas, the number is 001-202-420-5665. If you're calling from here in the U.S., the number is 1-202-420-5730. Congress has its own mind in these matters, and taking advantage of an election climate is pushing the agenda forward. They've also done something else which I thought was intriguing. There's a resolution currently making its way through the House to forbid contact between U.S. officials and Iranian officials, and that's something I know they've done with the Palestinians in the past. The question is, it most likely will not stand up to a court challenge, but how effective will this be in an election year in literally freezing any diplomacy at all?
I think the State Department is not going to take this one laying down. They're not pleased by it. But what it does show is the tremendously limited political space that the administration has when it comes to pursuing diplomatic solutions. It has far greater space when it comes to pursuing coercive and punitive measures such as sanctions. But when it comes to diplomacy, Congress has been very effective in closing that political space. And to be frank, the administration has been quite ineffective and quite weak when it comes to pushing back. But this one measure may be one in which Congress overreaches a little bit, because you can just imagine how the course of history would have changed if, in the middle of the Cuba crisis, American diplomats and officials did not have the right to be able to communicate to the other side. In fact, just to pose it to what Admiral Mullen said just in the last couple of weeks before he left office as the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, he said we need to have direct link with Iranians ASAP, because 30 years of not communicating has created a lot of misconceptions, a lot of misunderstandings. And when you misunderstand, you miscalculate. When you miscalculate, you escalate. And there are no de-escalatory mechanisms in place.
Here's the thing that intrigues me. We look at it from an American perspective of how the map of the Middle East has changed so dramatically in the last 2 years. But from an Iranian perspective, it has as well. Circumscribing action, but at the same time opening some space. The Iraq War opened space. Iran's taken advantage of that. One would suggest a bit too aggressively in pursuing policies across the Gulf, in strengthening its position in Lebanon, et cetera, clearly in Iraq. At the same time, they're losing ground in Syria. And how, I guess what I'm asking is, in terms of the chess game that's being played, where is advantage here? Do the Iranians understand the precariousness of this situation? Does it limit their options? Are they understanding that rules have changed and that they may be facing a very hostile American environment given the election, despite the fact that they've gained some ground logistically in the region?
The American environment tends to vary from hostile to very hostile, so I don't think they necessarily see a significant shift there. But I think Iran right now, or this government in Iran, is a government that has lost its momentum. As you mentioned, it's losing ground in Syria. You asked the question of who's winning. It's shifting very quickly, but I think it's quite clear that the Iranians have been taken quite aback by what has happened. I think they expected and they hoped for the fall of many of these governments in the region that had the backing of the United States. But they miscalculated, because they expected that the day these governments would fall, the people would go out on the streets and vent their anger not only against the dictators, but also against America. And so far, we have not seen a strong or not even a weak anti-American dimension in the Arab Spring. And I think that's really surprised Iran and has made it very difficult for them to take advantage of this and try to utilize it for their own favor. On the contrary, I think many of the people in the Arab world that are currently fighting for their own democratic rights do remember that 2 years ago, the Iranian people did the exact same, and they were met with significant brutality by the Iranian government.
Let me go to a California caller. Caller, your question. Hello?
Hello.
Yes, your question, please.
You know, my point was the fact that Iran is not allowed to have nuclear weapons because they're looked upon as kind of madmen. But yet, if when people calculate the response to an attack, they put forth that they're going to be rational and not do anything too crazy in a response to an attack. So I find it interesting. You know, on one hand, they're saying they're madmen, they can't be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, but then on the other hand, they're looked upon as being rational if we were to attack them.
Let me stop you there and ask Trita for a response.
I think the caller has made a very, very important observation. On the one hand, you hear these voices saying that the Iranian government is irrational, they're madmen, they're apocalyptic, they're suicidal. And then on the other hand, the very same elements who then, as a result of this calculation, say we have to have preemptive military strikes, on a dime shift and assume that there is a lot of rationality on the Iranian side when it comes to how they will react to a military confrontation. The caller is absolutely right. And I think it is somewhat disingenuous by those who are making the argument that the Iranian government is not rational. They know very well that it is. They know very well. But the thing is, if you want to make the case for war and preemptive action, you have to eliminate other options. By making the argument that the other side is suicidal and irrational, then you have eliminated both diplomacy and containment and deterrence as viable policy options. And you're left only with preemptive military strikes.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to
that's what this argument is driving the debate towards.
Let's go to Morocco for a call. Caller? Hello? Morocco? We don't have Morocco with us. I want to ask you about MEK, the Mujahideen. The delisting issue was supposed to have happened. The decision on that was supposed to have happened. Is it still in the works? And if so, where is it going to go?
By court order, the United States has to make that decision by the end of this year. And I think it cannot take much longer than sometime in December. It's a very tricky issue because, unfortunately, if it was simply based on whether this group has the intent and the capability and the history of conducting terrorism, it's a very clear-cut case. There's plenty of evidence that this is a terrorist organization, that it has the intentions to pursue terrorism, and that it has a long history of engaging in terrorism. But because of their efficient use of the weaknesses of the American political system, they have shuffled a lot of money into it and gotten a lot of very, very prominent U.S. officials to speak on their behalf. So they really amassed a major lobbying campaign that has put a lot of pressure on the State Department. And it remains to be seen if the decision will be made on the principles or if this pressure will be effective.
Let's go to Florida for a call. Caller? Caller, your question? Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, your question, please?
I wanted to know what the impact would be if the United States insisted that Israel also get rid of its nuclear weapons, and so we have Middle East free of nuclear weapons entirely.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see that happening anytime soon, but I think ultimately you're not going to be able to move to a more durable, more indigenously accepted and legitimized security architecture for the region unless the issue of Israeli nuclear weapons is addressed.
Let me ask you one
But
last...
it takes a lot of political will and courage in Washington. I don't see a lot of that right now.
Let me ask you one last question. In terms of the balance of power inside Iran itself, we've been following the story of the president and his travails with the supreme leader. Where is that now, and does this current situation play into his hand or not?
It shifts very fast, but I think the larger trend is that Ahmadinejad has experienced a lot of losses recently, but he's not out in any way, shape, or form. What it really has done is that it has brought the regime almost to a point in which you can almost say that there's signs of implosion. The amount of very, very intense enmity within the regime and the way that they're undermining each other is making the government completely dysfunctional. Just to give you an example, the parliament recently called in a couple of the ministers for no confidence votes and for questioning, and it keeps on happening all the time. And at one point, Ahmadinejad was overheard speaking with the Speaker of the Parliament, and the Speaker of the Parliament said, "Your government is dysfunctional." And Ahmadinejad responded with saying, "It's because you call us in here all the time to answer your questions. We cannot do our jobs." And in a way, both of them were right. They are completely dysfunctional. They can blame it on the other side, but they're both quite responsible for it. And that's also a very dangerous situation.
No good guys in the mix, though.
I would hardly say there's any good guys, because the fight is not about more democracy. The fight is just a brutal power grab by different factions within the government. None of them have any adherence to democracy.
Trita, thank you for joining us. Look
Thank you
forward
for
to
having
talking
me.
with you again. When we come back, Ellen Leipzin of the Stimson Center, and we'll take some more calls, so stay with us.